Welcome back to the crypt. Today we are going to address the top 3 things that went wrong in my second draft that I got feedback on, as well as I want to discuss possible solutions that I'm going to attempt upcoming. One more attempt to kind of dismantle the fear aspect of my mistakes, to no longer see my mistakes as a moral issue of any kind of mine, but just simply a part of the creation process and normalizing it as much as I can. So it is completely defanged and it's just a part of my process. And eventually, my ultimate goal is to enjoy the editing process, but I have to dismantle all of my fears, guilt, and self-hatred that I have towards making mistakes in the first place. It is world, character, and tone/point of view. This early on in the creation process, I feel like pretty much everyone makes these mistakes. I've seen these mistakes mirrored in every single person's work to some extent, sometimes more than others, but these are very, very common areas that need reworking. It is just a normal part of the process, which is why we're here today talking about it, because it needs to be normalized. But I want to actually go over examples of all 3 of these, so I'm hoping this makes sense even to people who haven't read Project Clockwork. I had an idea in my head of how the world functioned, and I thought I had put explanations of that in the story. Clearly no. It wasn't until my feedback crew pointed it out, but I actually did not properly explain pretty much anything of the world. I certainly didn't explain the relationship between the space colonies and the military, because the military is kind of its own entity. It doesn't technically have any governing power over the colonies. The colonies govern themselves, and there is a military that I don't want to compare it to the mafia, because I don't think it's quite that, but you pay dues in order to have the protection of military. And there are some colonies that lean into that really far and really feed into the military, such as having military programs of sending their people to the military specifically for training, and then like having a very symbiotic relationship. And there are other colonies that very reluctantly, pay money in order to have borders protected from hostiles, but they really dislike the military. They don't want the military to interfere at all with colony life. They're very strict about it. It varies depending on the colony, and that is something that I did not explain at all. I thought I had. I didn't, anywhere in the text, which is a massive problem. And this actually overflowed into interfering with the characters and interfering most specifically with the characters' motivations, because it's not well understood why Alex is being sent on their mission, or why the colony doesn't want the military involved or is trying to avoid the military as much as possible, but yet still fears military intervention. I need to make sure that's very clear in the text so that the relationship that they have to the main character is also better understood, because it interferes with how the main character proceeds with their investigation of this unknown station that, spoiler alert, does turn out to be a military facility that's been just free-floating. And not only do I have to make these things more clear, I do need to make these things clear very early on in the manuscript, which, I'm not gonna lie, is a little concerning, because I don't want to info dump, but this stuff needs to be understood, which kind of boils over into a solution that I'm thinking of for character, which is my next issue. So of course the main character is the main issue. Alex as a character has gone through so many changes. Originally in the very first draft, which was definitely a 0 draft, it was rough, it was fantasy, it wasn't even science fiction. Alex presented very feminine and used she/her pronouns. When I rewrote Alex initially, I realized that she/her did not fit anymore. I initially used she/her within the first 2 scenes, and something was so wrong. Every time I used it, it felt wrong for Alex as a character, and I couldn't explain. If you asked me to explain why, I don't know. I just know that it didn't feel correct for the character. And I was like, okay, let me just change the pronouns, see if it feels better. I changed it to they, them. It felt so much better. I did briefly experiment with he, him. That also did not feel right. It felt better than she, her, but still not correct. But this does mean that Alex as a character has completely evolved and changed from the original version, and that includes their personality type. Alex has always held a lot of fear and a little bit of anger and frustration, but also an insane level of burden of responsibility, some of which they've put on themselves and some of which has been put on them by others, which actually reflects more heavily the role of the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland, which heavily inspired all of Project Clockwork. So it more closely resembles White Queen than the traditional Alice character, which was interesting. And so originally I was playing with that concept of the roles almost being reversed, whereas Alex, which is put in the Alice role within the story, actually has more of a personality type of the White Queen. And the White Queen was supposed to mirror that and supposed to have more of the personality of the original Alice. It didn't actually pull off. This mirroring of characters didn't actually happen. And that's because the White Queen, which ended up being named Kai, was also incredibly different from the original. Like, a complete overhaul. Even the name of the character. Alex retains some variants of the original interpretation of them. White Queen does not. They are nothing like their original. Kai is an entirely unique character to the rewrite. And Draft 2 introduced a far darker, more corrupted side of Kai, which again is supposed to mirror Alex and kind of showcase a flipped image. However, again, it didn't actually work. Why? Because when I outlined the rewrite, I had never tried outlining before and I failed spectacularly. So what ended up happening when I wrote Project Clockwork and completed the rewrite back in 2019 for NaNoWriMo, I was creating these characters and relationships with not a lot of knowledge of what the endgame for it was. Originally, the relationship between Alex and the White Queen was not going to be romantic at all. It was never supposed to be that way. There was never supposed to be that subplot. That subplot was birthed while writing, and you can tell because it's rushed and the pacing is totally off. It also, I need to again define both characters aside and apart from themselves first before they converge together as characters. The problem with that is the way the workbook is written right now, you do not meet the White Queen until they meet Alex, because the viewpoint is entirely focused on Alex as a character. This creates all kinds of problems, which I'm going to get to in the next bit. But pretty much what this means is I need to go into the backstory of both of these characters separately before the incident happens, which ends up bringing them together. This means a lot of writing of completely new scenes, and I need to go pretty far back in the story, by about 2.5 years back. It does mean that in my mind, I'm going to have to actually restructure the story a bit, which is going to affect the tone and possibly the point of view, which is the next bit. Now, I have recently been going through Audible of The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And the reason I'm doing that is because I feel like I did not get the tone of Wonderland. Yes, it is darker. Yes, it is a more mature sci-fi variation. But it still needs to have a coherent tonality that calls back to original. And I feel like I missed that in a lot of different areas. So I went back and I'm listening to the original. And right off the bat, I remembered, as I was listening, I was like, oh yeah, the narrator. The narrator is its own character within Alice in Wonderland. There's a clear narrator that tells you what's going on, and whether or not they're reliable is debatable. I think Lewis Carroll wanted the narrator to be reliable because the narrator is essentially Lewis Carroll. However, the reality is this is a narrator with their own points of view and personality that's also adding in. But it makes all of these small little bizarre tales and offshoots and whimsical elements, it pulls them together in a single story because the narrator is referring to all of it and connecting all the dots. What's happening with Alex and Kai is they are trapped within this kind of different dimension caused by these interdimensional aliens, and these aliens are observing them. It would make sense that there could be possibly a narrator who is another interdimensional creature that is telling all of this and compiling this information together. That's what the aliens are supposedly doing anyway for all kinds of research purposes on their end. So it's possible I could create a narrator. However, this narrator would not be human, first off, which could create a problem of being distanced from the two main characters. But some of the benefits of this could possibly be being able to split off with those two characters and still be consistent within the story. So I can have a part 1 of the story, which is actually a year to 2 years prior to the events of the story as of right now. So before the ship is abandoned, before the ship is floating in space, before Alex even becomes captain of Reliant and ends up being sent on a mission to try to find this abandoned ship. Before all of that happens, before the incident that kills everyone on that ship, who were these people, what were they doing, and what led them to the choices they ended up making at the very beginning of what the story is now. What's interesting is in an earlier variation, the first rewrite, I did actually have a character that might fulfill the role of narrator. I had a character called the Observer. The Observer was completely trashed and taken out of draft 2 because the Observer just didn't do enough. Because he wasn't supposed to. He's supposed to observe, he's not supposed to interfere. But I just felt like he didn't add enough to the story, so I removed him. But this was all being written with a point of view very narrow onto Alex and Alex alone. If I had the Observer as the narrator character, not only would I be able to split between two characters a lot more and give more of that mirroring that I originally wanted to do, it was also going to allow me to showcase the world from the perspective of someone trying to figure out the world, which gives me a vehicle for explaining the world better, which pulls in the world building. In theory, this is going to solve a lot of problems. It solves the problems of tone and voice because it's going to be one narrator telling the entire tale from start to finish. 2, it allows me to pull multiple characters and show backstory for them a lot easier and being consistent within the story. 3, it should, in theory, allow me a vehicle for explaining the world a lot better through the eyes of a creature who's trying to figure it out, which allows you as the reader to also figure it out along the way. In theory, this is going to solve problems. In practice, this is a terrifying idea. I'm going to need to rewrite a lot of this story, and I knew I was going to no matter what, but I'm going to have to do a lot of work. This is so much labor in order to get this to work. I have no idea if it's going to work. So, those are my 3 problems in me breaking them down and trying to figure out solutions that may possibly work. If you're interested, follow me as I try to address all of this stuff and see what happens. Please feel free to hit the subscribe button down below and the bell notification. It's going to be a hell of an end of year for me, that's for sure. Thank you guys so much for hearing me ramble and try to problem solve as we go. I hope you guys and your projects are doing well this year. See you next time.